He went against the party line on this
Yeah,
one,
he
and he
did.
did it for the betterment of our state. That's a politician's job.
Absolutely.
Like, kudos to you, Bill Cassidy,
Yeah,
for
big
doing your
props.
job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
$1.2 trillion act.
Pass this legislation, and here are the good
things,
that
right?
are
There's
happening,
good things.
right?
We can't come up with solutions if we're trying to eradicate education in the first place. We
Oh
all know
my
the
gosh.
gridlock. It doesn't matter if you're coming from New Orleans, from Lafayette, from Shreveport. You
Can
hit
we
Baton
get another
Rouge,
bridge at
and we
Baton
all
Rouge?
just collectively lose it. Hey guys, real quick, before we get into it, do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. That way, you don't miss out on any of the tea. Thanks. Natasha, I have a question for you
Yes, Charles.
to start off our next episode. To state the obvious, you know, there's a lot of division in Louisiana of how we
Yes.
view things, just like every other state in the country.
Yeah.
But I'm going to go on a ledge here and say that there's one thing that we can all agree on in this state, whether it's North Louisiana, South Louisiana, everywhere in between. And that's that we have terrible roads, terrible infrastructure, terrible bridges, dilapidated everything. What do you think about that?
I think most folks would agree with that. I think the way you can tell when you've made it home to Louisiana, whether you're coming from west or coming from the east, is when you hit a pothole.
Mm-hmm. And so I think we should dedicate a whole episode to this. What do you think?
I think we should get into it.
Cool, because you
Let's
know
talk
why?
about-
I feel very strongly about this. So we're gonna go into this.
Let's talk about Louisiana infrastructure.
Great. So this episode is looking at what we call kind of a little alliteration here, some federal funds flowing into Louisiana, right? Federal funds flowing into Louisiana. So I'm going to give a little context for everybody out there. The U.S. passed a monumental piece of legislation in
Yes.
2021, an emphasis on the fact that it was bipartisan, called the Infrastructure Investments Act. And arguably, this is the biggest piece of infrastructure investment since the New Deal in the 1930s,
Which is
which
significant.
built the roads and bridges of which we are discussing. And from kind of an urban planning perspective, there's typically like a 60-year lifespan on this stuff. So we're at that mark, if not having surpassed
Maybe
it,
a little
right?
bit past it.
So to simplify a very complex bill, this bill is aiming to update all of this infrastructure nationwide.
Yeah.
Okay. And it got, like I said, bipartisan support, and this is a $1.2 trillion act that is investing in every state in this country in terms of infrastructure. Now, that includes bridges, roads, things like clean energy programs, municipal buildings. I mean, anything that you can think of, broadband access, EVs, manufacturing, you name it, right? And when Louisiana comes into play, we had a politician that was very integral to this piece of legislation. That was Senator Bill Cassidy.
Yeah.
He led this, and that in part led to the bipartisan passage of this bill. But every other Louisiana Republican voted against this bill. And the only other person to vote for it was Senator Troy Carter, a Democrat.
Right.
Now, my question to you is, despite the fact that we all know that we have horrible infrastructure, and despite the fact that it was shown that Louisiana would get an ungodly amount of money from this bill, why was it that all of our state Republicans voted against this bill?
Well, I think we know why.
Go for it.
You know, one of the stances that we see from the Republican Party, right, is small federal government, that, you know, we don't want to see tax funds used for things that are deemed frivolous, quote unquote, or inappropriate. I think there is just a general resistance to whether at the federal or state level signing these types of legislation, because I think there is a perception that, at least from a conservative perspective, tax dollars should stay in very local pockets. But if we understand concepts around risk pools, we know that pooling into a bigger pot allows us to help more broadly. But we definitely understand why we see resistance from our Republican legislators to supporting this type of legislation.
So, all correct, and very much agree with you, but here's the interesting thing. Louisiana is disproportionately benefiting from this bill. We have received insane amounts of money to invest in our infrastructure. And you know what just grinds my gears?
Do tell.
Is the audacity of these state politicians who voted against this to be at the ribbon cutting of the launching of these events and to say, look what we got in our town. The disingenuous of that profoundly, to my deep down core, bothers me so much because you voted against this, yet you're taking credit for it. And that just does not sit well with me.
But let me ask you a
Yeah.
question, Charles. What responsibility is there on the part of the populace
Hmm.
in that, right? Because the reason that these politicians continue to maintain the stance that they do is it is their party line.
Correct.
And their party line is why the constituents that they have vote for them. Those same constituents, though, are the people who enjoy nice new roads,
Reaping the benefits of
who
this.
want repaired or new bridges, who want to have, job creation come from these types
Absolutely.
of initiatives. So that disconnect might actually reside down at the part of the constituents, no?
No, I agree. And, this leads to a larger conversation of which we don't even have the means to get into of kind of a national reckoning with people being able to identify who is giving what in terms of politicians, who's passing what legislation, who's benefiting from what legislation, right? And we're living in an age of misinformation,
Yeah,
right? And so people are unable to identify where these um, investments are coming from,
yeah.
right? And a particularly interesting example that came out of this infrastructure bill was a lot of the infrastructure bill was through tax credits, right?
Hmm.
And kind of subsidies and investments is broadband access,
Yes.
right? So we have an incredible digital divide in this country, and that digital divide is primarily along geographic lines, right? So your small towns, rural areas, but also inner city neighborhoods
Yep.
don't have adequate access to good, reliable internet. And this all came to a halt in the pandemic, right?
Yep.
When everything switched online and we needed online education. Louisiana has gotten more money than any other state. It's called the GUMBO program, right? Grants for underserved communities to get broadband access. I can't remember the exact terminology, but we've gotten more. And actually, to give Louisiana some credit, we've implemented it very
Yeah.
well, actually, through every part of the state, right? And that just gets back to my point that this is something that we know that we all need, yet these politicians voted against. And it's just it's just the disconnect just is so unsettling to me, right? Um, and other things like coastal programs,
Yeah.
coastal restoration programs, flooding mitigation programs, right? These are tangible, objective benefits that we are getting statewide that people are benefiting from, yet theoretically, at the end of the day, would ultimately end up voting against these issues, not knowing who is in support of these issues, right?
Absolutely. And I think the broadband piece too is really huge because one of the things that I don't necessarily think people in New Orleans really fully appreciate is just how rural the rest of
Yeah,
the state
absolutely.
is. I think sometimes rural is seen as a bad thing or a negative connotation, and it's not, right? Like it is just a descriptor for what that community is. Just because a place is rural does not mean that they shouldn't have many of the same access and benefits that we see in larger municipalities, right? When you talk about something like broadband access, so much of everything we do in everyday life
Yeah.
now is internet based, right? If you want to bank, if you want to access governmental services, if you
Homework for students.
yeah, doing homework, particularly in communities that may not necessarily have access to medical professionals that are in certain specialties. That allows for telemedicine. So you have
Another great point.
so many things
Yeah.
that come with that. The importance of ensuring that, again, not just those constituents who live in New Orleans or Baton Rouge or Shreveport or Lake Charles have access to those things, but in communities like Eunice and Mamu and down in Terrebonne, that all across the state, we are making sure that there's equal opportunity
Right.
for everyone. And these kinds of dollars coming into our state ensure that. It's really unfortunate that, again, there is such a disconnect between seeing these benefits, seeing these improvements, and not truly understanding where they are coming
Yeah,
from and how the politicians that you've elected did or did
absolutely.
not ensure that those dollars made it to your
Exactly. And
community.
you know, that's where I give credit to Bill Cassidy, right? We may
Absolutely.
not agree with everything, but he's a pretty centrist moderate and he's very pragmatic. I will give him
Absolutely.
that. And he really had this great quote that kind of summarized
Yeah, he
why he
did.
both championed this, led this effort, and tried to persuade his political party within the state to pass this, but they didn't, right? And he ended up being the only one. I think we should read that quote. What do you
Yeah, he
think?
did. So Bill Cassidy said, "This infrastructure package will rebuild our roads and bridges, increase access to high speed internet, strengthen our electric grid, add levee protection, and improve flood resiliency. Almost every corner of our state was hit by natural disasters in the last year. We must have the federal investment to protect us from future storms." And I think that that
Powerful.
quote literally hits all of the high points around those pain points that impact every single citizen of Louisiana, from North Louisiana to South Louisiana, from East Louisiana to West Louisiana. What are we impacted by? Natural disasters, storms, and then the ability to recover from those
Correct.
things. And for him to have the foresight to see that, but also
Absolutely.
the fortitude to stand against his fellow party members and really
Yes.
champion and support this, I think says so much about him as a politician, right? Because he went against the party line on this
Yeah,
one
he
and he
did.
did it for the betterment of our state and for the benefit of his
Which we
constituents.
are
And
seeing.
that's a politician's job. Like,
Absolutely.
kudos to you, Bill Cassidy,
Yeah,
for
big
doing your
props.
job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I really appreciate that, right? And again, like I don't want to take away from the fact that I am happy that we are benefiting from this, right? Regardless of whether or not people are
Yeah.
able to identify,
Yeah,
right?
but it's important to
It is
call out that
correct. It is
disconnect.
important to call that out, right? I just hope that people kind of, a takeaway message from this is really, we have kind of created a false balance in terms of how we think about politics in this country. But,
Mhm.
despite the abstract conversations that we have, you can pinpoint tangible, and your evidence is legislation and policies laws that are passed.
Absolutely.
So, I know that a lot of people out there they're disheartened at politics in general, but like you actually can tell that there are differences, right? And
Yeah.
again, through passage of legislation of stuff like that, right? And it's not just the infrastructure bill. We also had the Inflation Reduction Act,
Yep.
right? And that provided a whole other series of benefits. And what's interesting about that one is that um, apart from the Inflation Act, not one single Republican voted for the Inflation Reduction
Correct.
Act. And like the Infrastructure Act, we are seeing tangible, objective benefits from this bill,
Yeah.
right? And again, that dissonance between not voting for it, but having the audacity to take credit for it. So can you kind of tell what are some benefits from that particular act that Louisiana is getting?
So we know that this act is bringing in things like clean energy
Yeah, which we need.
initiatives, electric vehicle battery building, more expansion of Medicaid, which is very important when we consider those federal dollars that also come into play with the Affordable Care Act that expanded Medicaid initially. We're seeing some tax credits that are coming through, and also prescription drugs,
Yep,
some
big
fixed
one.
pricing on that piece, which we know is extremely critical in this country as we look at the just exorbitant expense of healthcare and ways to start to mitigate that for everyday people. So, a lot of significant things that came through. That again, when we look at access to healthcare, when we look at impact of storms and climate change here in our state, all of these things that we can see those direct impacts to
Absolutely.
us on a day-to-day basis here in Louisiana. And I think you made, such a good point of, we talk a lot about when legislation goes bad,
Yeah, we
right?
do.
This law passed and it made this thing increase in price, or this law passed and it had this either intended or unintended negative consequence. But I don't think we talk enough about these sorts of things where we passed this legislation, and here are the good
Good
things
things,
that
right?
are
There's good
happening,
things.
right? When we talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, you can look at the congressional districts here in Louisiana that favored Trump in 2020, and they've received 3 times as much clean energy and manufacturing investments as those that lean towards Biden
Three
in that
times.
election. 3 times the dollars. When we talk about those dollars coming into those districts, right? It's about initiatives around ensuring that our coast does not continue to erode. It's about
Hardening our electric grid
right. And the job creation that
comes
comes from
with
those
it.
types of initiatives,
Mhm.
right? Manufacturing investments means we're going to put money into building
Correct.
things,
Correct.
but you need people to do that.
Correct.
So it is so critically important, I think, to continue to reiterate what legislation like this does
Mhm.
and really point to those direct, tangible downstream impacts that it has.
And also, having we're having a knowledge and ignorance problem, right? Being able to say, "I know who voted for this,"
Yeah.
because what ends up happening, and we saw this with the recent election, right? People don't necessarily know what they're voting for, or
Yeah,
what people
absolutely.
stand for, or even who's running,
Right?
right? And this leads to, in my opinion, these false conversations of wanting both to be equally bad when they're actually
Not.
not.
Yeah.
Right, and I think that just frustrates me because it's leading to more division than is necessary,
Well, it
okay?
also divorces politicians from true accountability
I was about
to
to
their
say that,
constituents,
accountability, yep.
right? At the end of the day, all of our elected officials, whether the president of the United States or your local alderman, they are public servants.
Correct.
They are beholden to us as the public, and their job is to serve our best interests. And I think, again, whether we think it's good legislation or bad legislation, when we divorce politicians from their voting records, when we don't have that clear linkage between this was the legislation, this is the result, and this is who supported it, it really allows people to take credit for things they shouldn't be taking credit
Ooh,
for, but
yes.
also fly under the radar and not be held accountable in the ways that they should be held accountable. And I think that's one of the really unfortunate things that we're really starting to see happen in our political system, again at the federal level and even very down at the most
Yeah,
local of local
I
levels,
could not agree more.
is people do understand the laws that are being passed and who is actually behind passing them.
I agree. And and this is a bigger conversation on the side, but this leads to just a larger idea of, everything connects, right? And I do that a lot in my classes. Everything starts to connect when you put it together.
Yeah.
This leads to why we are seeing an increase in attacks on education or
Hmm.
social sciences or social studies, right? Because cliche knowledge is power, right?
Absolutely.
So educating people, and we saw this very clear at the recent election. There's a wide gap between those who voted who based off of misinformation and those who voted on the facts,
Right.
right? And there's a lot of other things that need to be addressed and how we message and communicate to people. But a big thing that this all goes back to is we have a population that is increasingly not understanding civics 101.
Yeah.
And that's a problem,
Yeah.
right? Um, and that requires a longer term solution, but we can't come up with solutions if we're trying to eradicate education in the first place,
Yeah, but I
right?
think kind of bringing it back, right? This is why things like the Infrastructure Act are so important, right?
Correct.
Because those dollars coming in for something like broadband allows school districts to have access to information that they might not necessarily have
Correct.
had.
So
Now,
as to teach these things,
right.
it all
So
connects.
now we still need to ensure that those things are being taught, that that information is being shared. Um, but we've at least got to do the first piece, right? Places that don't have access to internet needed it
Correct.
in order to even accomplish that. So I think, this is the building block of creating a better community. This is the building block of, ensuring the future of our state, ensuring that we can grow and flourish and be prosperous as a state. We cannot really draw on the resources we have, whether it is natural resources or whether it's our people
Yeah,
resources, unless we have solid infrastructure in place to accomplish that. And I think, reiterating and reminding people of the good things that are coming out of it, the changes that are happening, the ways that those dollars are actually being used to improve our state is so important. I think, the thing that people love to say here, right, is Louisiana ranks last and this and this and this. Like we're constantly kind of beating that drum.
yeah, we are.
But you know what? We are right now at the top of having received dollars for broadband expansion. We are ranking really high on having received dollars for clean energy and manufacturing investment. And like those are good things.
Those are very good things.
What's important is how are we going to take that as a state and run with that and move forward and make sure that we are implementing programs and doing things to ensure that those dollars don't get lost,
Agreed.
and that we don't lose momentum on continuing to improve, right? Like
But
if you're
also,
at the bottom, the only place you can go
goes
is
up,
up.
right? But and to go back to your point with which I very much agree is also holding our politicians accountable,
Absolutely.
right? That's critical,
Yeah.
right? And I kind of just wanted to say this, when we talk about infrastructure, it's not just the bridges and the roads, right? We're
Yeah.
building human infrastructure, which is the broadband thing, for instance,
Yeah.
right? And again, these are things that are generational, right? These are long-term
Absolutely.
generational investments that are absolutely critical. We're simultaneously catching up, but also setting us up for a better
Or a better future.
future, right? And I think that just goes back to how we started this episode, was just this deep frustration that we actually do agree on a lot of things in this state.
Mhm.
We've been misled through an illusion to believe that we actually don't.
Yeah.
And that leads to a lot of discord and chaos that is not needed, ultimately works against us, right? While at the end of the day, sure, Southeast Louisiana has different priorities than Northeast Louisiana, we still have commonalities that
Yeah.
we all have. And it is very evident through these two pieces of legislation that we can have solutions,
Absolutely.
right? I kind of use my class often as a microcosm of society at large. And when I present to them, did y'all know that Louisiana got these 10 things from the bill? They're in shock.
Right.
Have no
Nobody
idea.
knows that.
Wait, what? Yes, there's actually like good things happening.
Yeah.
And interestingly, I read the news a lot. The Washington Post did this interactive feature like 2 weeks ago of you can literally type in your zip code
Mhm.
and see what specific investments have come from these two pieces of legislation, right? And they did it very detailed, down to the maps, and did all these correlations. And again, it went back to this idea that the states that are disproportionately benefit from this are the ones whose politicians voted
Good
against
against
this,
it. Wow.
right? I would absolutely provide that link for people. I think it's very
Yeah, it'll be
interesting
in
and
the show
fascinating.
notes for everyone to check out their zips.
1000%, right? But again, this is important, right? We need to know where this stuff is coming from,
Yeah.
especially at this time that we are living in America. So I really hope that this begins a longer conversation of where we want to go as a state,
Absolutely.
in terms of electing leaders and demanding more from them,
Yeah.
like Bill Cassidy, right? He came through.
Yeah.
Right. And that exemplifies that we still can accomplish stuff despite being a very divided society.
Absolutely. I think House Representative Tammy Phelps said it best in our Pelican Pop-In with her, where she said, we're really more alike in this
Yeah.
state than we give ourselves credit for.
We are.
And it's so, so true. And I think this sort of legislation really reflects where those shared needs, shared commonalities really converge, and we can all go, oh, wait, like this really benefits all of us.
Mhm.
And it makes Louisiana as a whole better. And it's one of those things too where I think so often the frustration is when we talk about Louisiana, people think we're talking about New Orleans.
Mhm.
And this is one of those areas where it's like, no, this is about Louisiana.
Yeah.
This is about our state broadly, and it has benefited our state broadly, and will continue to benefit
agree.
our state broadly.
I think this is kind of funny, but I think this kind of drives the point home is, regardless of where you live in the state, I think we can all agree that it is for the betterment of the state as a whole to build another bridge in Baton Rouge. We
Oh
all know
my
the
gosh.
gridlock. It doesn't matter if you're coming from New Orleans, from Lafayette, from Shreveport. You
Can
hit
we get
Baton
another
Rouge,
bridge in
and we
Baton
all just
Rouge?
collectively lose it,
Yeah.
right? If that is not symbolic enough of why this is a statewide investment, like that is for the betterment of all of us.
All of us,
It is
yeah.
for the betterment of all of us to create a consistent interstate between Lafayette and New Orleans, right? That's
Yeah.
also part of this. To build that scary bridge in Lake Charles, right? These
Yeah.
are things that we all know, and again, we're benefiting from it, right? But I want and need people to understand that it is really up to who we elect if they want to come through. At the end of the day, we could have had where all of our politicians voted against this.
Yeah.
And that would have been to the detriment of
our
this state.
Yeah.
Right? So again, I hope that people are able to move from the abstract to the tangible and actually able to identify these benefits.
And that benefit not just to everyday life, right? Because we'd all have way less headaches with another bridge in Baton Rouge, but also the economic driving
Oh,
of
yeah.
that, right? Being able to move goods more
Critical.
efficiently, being able to move more goods through our state, that helps us, that benefits us. We have a major port at
Big.
the foot of our state, being able to say, we can bring it in and then easily disperse it through the rest of the country. Those things are important. And that's what this kind of legislation helps us to reinforce, but also build for the future.
And I also hope that this also leads to more of a regional cohesion that we don't necessarily have.
Yeah.
It benefits all of us to invest in the Port of New Orleans, to invest in Baton Rouge, because they're an hour away from each other.
Yeah.
Right? And then when the goods come through New Orleans, they go through the rest of the state, onto the interstates, into the bridges. It's all an ecosystem.
Correct.
And we all need to work together.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know if this is wishful thinking or not, but I hope that these are things that are slowly changing course in how we view this stuff.
Yeah.
And like you said, the only place you can go when you're at the bottom for decades is up. So yeah, I guess, we'll see, but at the end of the day, this money is flowing in.
Yeah.
It is coming. I hope that people start to see the benefits and realize that there are consequences to how we vote, and that consequence can go in either a good way or a bad way, and be able to identify where that came from. So do you have any kind of final thoughts on where this is going?
I mean, for me, this is one of those things that I am like, I want to champion this. I want to make sure we're talking about it because it is so important and so valuable. And I don't think enough people know that it's going on.
Yeah. But you know what? They're going to know through this podcast.
Yes, they are. So everybody can talk about GUMBO broadband program. Everybody can talk about, the infrastructure that's
Look up
coming
your
to
zip
Louisiana.
code. When I send that link, you'll see what is flowing into your community.
Yeah. And then check and see how your politicians voted so you know who to thank.
Absolutely. And you know what? I think it's a great way to end on that.
Absolutely, Charles.
This is a great conversation, a very important conversation, and we'll see where we go from here.
Yeah, I look forward to keeping our eyes on this and, keeping our listeners abreast of everything that's happening.
Absolutely. To be continued.
TBD. Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Pelican Briefs.
If you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button.
If you are loving the show, you can help us keep the conversation going by supporting us on Patreon.
Your contribution on Patreon ensures we can continue producing quality content you love.
Click the link in the description to become a patron today.
Until next time, this is Pelican Briefs.